Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Cole. It's Sunday afternoon, September 22nd, and this is the announcement for Week 6 of Political Science 3753 Con Law for the fall 2024 term. All right, everybody. On the syllabus for this week, we have the class notes for lectures 9 and 10. We also have a quiz, a discussion, and the midterm exam coming up over the next couple of weeks. So I wanted to say a few words about all that. Okay, everybody. In lectures 9 and 10, we move from executive power to congressional power. And we call these two lectures are called the commerce, spending, and taxing powers. So, three areas in which Congress has power: the power to tax and spend, and especially the power to regulate commerce. Okay. Commerce among the states, which is something that was absent from the Articles of Confederation. Now let me say just a few words about what you would be looking at in the notes for lectures 9 and 10. We begin with Gibbons versus Ogden from back in the 19th century. It's one of the first major cases dealing with the commerce power. Okay, and the Supreme Court ended up finding for a fairly broad federal commerce power, but it's important to note the commerce power really lay dormant. Okay, the congressional commerce power, it largely was unexercised until the late 19th century with the establishment of the Interstate Commerce Commission, and then even more so as we get into the 1930s and 40s with the Great Depression and the New Deal of President Franklin D. Roosevelt in its aftermath. Okay, so as you look at Gibbons versus Ogden, one of the questions the Supreme Court has to deal with is, what if Congress refrains from exercising the commerce power? Okay, can the states then move in and regulate commerce on their own, or can they not? And the way we set this up, they go through several alternatives that they reject before finally settling on a doctrine that, but the question really takes on broader application in the late 19th century into the 20th as Congress becomes more proactive about exercising the commerce power. Now, much of what you find here, everybody, deals with the Supreme Court's response to the New Deal and the new government programs of a different nature than what the federal government had engaged in the past. And the court first resists this, but eventually comes around and goes along with it. And it's always been controversial to what extent did the Supreme Court capitulate to sheer political pressure here, because the President Roosevelt did at one point propose a court packing plan. And you might have heard that kind of thing is being discussed even in the present day, okay, to add justices to the Supreme Court. Eventually that was not done. The membership of the court remains at 9, and it's been there ever since the 19th century. But the Supreme Court eventually reversed itself on the New Deal, and constitutional scholar Lewis Fisher, on whose work I based much of my class notes, believes it really wasn't a matter of sheer capitulation to political pressure, but different scholars and pundits and commentators are going to differ on that issue. Okay. Now, among the issues that we look at as we move from Lecture 9 to Lecture 10, the use of the commerce power to enforce civil rights legislation as we get into the period of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Okay, much of what the feds did in that area eventually, they appealed to the commerce power as its justification. And one example of that is the case of South Carolina versus Katzenbach that I've sent to you as an attachment. And it's also up on the course website. We will be discussing that. We'll have occasion to touch on that this week and next week. South Carolina versus Katzenbach. Now, another thing that's going on, everybody, and there's been a Supreme Court decision really just a few weeks ago that I've had to add to the syllabus. This issue of the doctrine of so-called Chevron deference. Okay. Chevron deference is a doctrine that was laid down to the Supreme Court by the Supreme Court in the 1980s in a case that involved the Chevron corporations. Hence, it's called Chevron deference. And at that time, the Supreme Court said, okay, in case of any question about the interpretation of a law enabling or authorizing a regulatory agency, okay, the court should defer to the agency's own interpretation of its authority, as long as that interpretation was not unreasonable on its face. Okay, that goes back to 1984, the case of Chevron USA versus the Natural Resources Defense Council, and that doctrine is known as Chevron deference. Well, as the years have passed, ideological conservatives became more and more impatient with the doctrine of Chevron deference because they came to feel it was tantamount to making the regulatory agencies laws unto themselves. In other words, they had usurped legislative power. They were making decisions that were tantamount to making law. Okay, and just this term that's just recently been completed, in the Loper-Bright case, the Supreme Court took that opportunity to overturn the doctrine of Chevron deference. And there are those who are saying, well, they've effectively gutted the power of the federal government and its regulatory agencies to, say, protect the environment. Okay. But all that is discussed in the class notes for Lecture 10. Okay. It's been something of a political football in American government, and it's become a partisan issue whether we were going to continue to observe the doctrine of Chevron deference. And it's been, for the time being at least, overturned in the Loper-Bright case. It was decided really just a few weeks ago, this past summer, before the Supreme Court's term ended. All right, now, everybody, on Friday the 27th, we have a quiz. It'll be our last quiz before the midterm exam. There's one case from the textbook I'm asking you to look at, plus that South Carolina versus Katzenbach case for which I've sent you the attachment. And that attachment is also up on the course website. Okay. Then there's also an online article that I'm going to ask you to look at. This article goes back about a decade, but it does reflect the views of the so-called conservative legal movement. And most all of the three people that Trump appointed to the Supreme Court are tied to the so-called conservative legal movement. Okay. Now you'll be reading about the views of Randy Barnett of Georgetown University. He, of course, is not on the Supreme Court, and the justices on the Supreme Court may not want to go as far as he wants to go, but it'll give you a representative sample of the thinking of many of the people associated with the Republican Party and the Trump administration. To some extent, this will also be true of the 6 Republican appointees to the Supreme Court. So that's worth taking a look at. Now, that's on the 27th. Then the following week, on the 30th and October 1st, that's a Monday and Tuesday, not this coming week, but the following week, we have a discussion about federalism and voting rights. We have federalism on the syllabus for the last week before the midterm exam. We have some federalism issues coming up this week. Okay, but what we have, we call lectures 11 and 12, those class notes, federalism. Okay, and federalism is largely about government. Federalism issues largely about matters of government regulation of the economy and economic programs, taxing and spending programs. But they also come up with regard to civil rights and voting rights. So we'll actually look at some material with regard to federalism and voting rights. And we'll be discussing that on the 30th and the 1st. And then the midterm will be Friday the 4th. I had put it on the syllabus for the 3rd and 4th, 48 hours. And I may do that for the final exam. But for the midterm, let's go ahead and confine it to 24 hours on Friday the 4th. And the material will be the class notes for lectures 1 through 12, plus materials I've assigned for the 3 quizzes, including the one on Friday the 27th. Look for a few of those, maybe 10 or 15 of those items on the quizzes to be repeated. Okay. So, we have the class notes for lectures 9 and 10 this week, lectures 11 and 12 next week on federalism, and that will be the last material before the midterm exam. We'll have our third quiz Friday the 27th. We'll have our third discussion on the 30th and October 1st, and then the midterm exam will be Friday the 4th. Okay, so, hope that's all clear. I've sent announcements out about all of it. So take a look at those. They're in your inbox and they're up on the course website. So we'll be talking to you one more time before the midterm exam about a week from now at this time. We'll talk to you at that time about federalism issues and the class notes for lectures 11 and 12, and a bit more perhaps about the midterm exam itself. So hope all that's clear. Quiz on the 27th, discussion on the 30th and the 1st, and the midterm exam on the 4th. And we still have the class notes for lectures 9, 10, 11, and 12 to look at before we get to the midterm exam. So, hope that's not too much a cause for confusion. Any questions, comments, issues, problems, contact me through the website or at david.cole@opsu.edu. And otherwise, we'll be talking to you once again about a week from now at this time, which will be our last message before the midterm exam. Take it easy, study hard. Thanks a lot.